Well, thank you everyone for coming out. Love to see a big crowd for a talk like this. It's going to be a little bit academic, but it's my passion, so I hope it's yours too. So I wanted to discuss the origins of libertarianism from an ethical position. People come in through all sorts of different types of doors, and I came in through studying philosophy and economics through college, and so this sort of subject matter was most familiar to me. I hope to make it a little bit more familiar for all of you too. If you recall some of my previous presentations, they were filled with a little more pictures, animation, fun stuff, all sorts of stuff. This is going to be a bit more austere. Didn't have quite the time to prepare as I wanted to. Was trying to escape North Nevada desert, as some of you saw in the news of Burning Man recently. So that's okay. All the content that would be on here is actually in here, and I hope that it comes out here. So, with that said, let's get started. So, the first thing to know about libertarianism from a foundational ethical position is what's known as the non-aggression principle. And the non-aggression principle you can see echoed in all sorts of other different philosophies and different world religions and so forth, but modern day libertarianism has really sort of distilled it down into a prohibition on violating the physical integrity of other people and their property. And it's important that I bolded and italicized physical integrity because all sorts of other people or thinkers have had broader definitions that allow for various things to creep in under the guise of this or that being libertarian. And so I wanted to specify specifically physical integrity, right? This non-aggression principle doesn't prohibit you from hurting people's feelings, right? It doesn't prohibit you from copying some patterns of information. It prohibits you from physically altering, tampering with a person's body and their property. And there's 1,000 ways in which that can happen. Robbery, rape, arson, murder, et cetera, and all that. And so libertarianism, as an ethical philosophy, is about promoting and defending this principle. And I'll get into justifications for this principle throughout the presentation. I just wanted to state up front what is the beating heart of this position. So libertarianism as an ethical position promotes non-aggression, that it is not justifiable for you to initiate force on people, for you to initiate violence on people, on other people or their property. Now there's political libertarianism that extends that into the political sphere, right, that challenges government policies, that challenges various sort of social policies that rely on aggression. And I'm not going to get into political discussion, political philosophy here so much. I'm going to stick strictly to the ethical domain. And so this is going to be a bit of a survey course in different, let's say, moral foundations that you might have encountered if you had taken a 101 in philosophy or a 101 in ethics in college. And so I'm going to go through a few of them. If you'd like more detail on any one of them, please come see me afterwards. We can discuss it more sort of ad nauseum. This presentation is sort of based on a paper I wrote probably about 10 years ago. It was my capstone paper for my philosophy minor, trying to defend libertarianism as an ethical position. So if you're interested in that, I can share that with you as well. It's a bit dated, but it's still true. Okay. So the first element of this to discuss is probably the most obvious and practical, which is, hey, listen, free markets work, right? Like non-aggression, right? If I agree not to initiate force on you, and you agree not to initiate force on me, and we reserve force for self-defense, right, or defense of others, and potentially, some kind of redistributive justice, there's argument for that. But if we restrict force to that, then there is no chance for us to harm each other in this sort of literal sense I've described, right? I cannot, punch you in the face, I cannot take your things, I cannot, carry you away somewhere, right? We cannot harm each other physically if we agree not to commit aggression. So what happens at that point is that society really flourishes, right? So if we all agree by this ethic that we're not going to impose or initiate force on others, then that is the definition of peace from this position, right? Peace just is the state of affairs where nobody is committing violence against other people. And when you have a world that is abundantly peaceful, you get things like prosperity, right? People can actually make long-term decisions, have long-term planning horizon. They can actually think in the future because they can rely on future security of their assets, of their wealth, their capital, right? So peace promotes capital development, it promotes trust, it promotes all these elements of social cooperation, right? And if we restrict the government to an extremely small role as some kind of night watchman state, some kind of what's known as a minarchist sort of state, or if we have no state at all and we allow individuals and private associations and groups to provide for protection, then you have a world that would be tremendously prosperous, right? So from a utilitarian standpoint, an ethical standpoint that is concerned with achieving the best outcome for the most amount of people, right, that is maximizing the highest amount of utility we all enjoy, the non-aggression principle allows for a tremendous amount of peace and prosperity in the world. And so you have all sorts of thinkers ranging in history making this type of argument, right? And so you have in the top left Adam Smith, who is, sort of, let's just say the founder of sort of classical economic thinking, that is trying to describe the dynamics by which peaceful interactions lead to more social cooperation, that lead to more trade, that lead to more investment, that lead to more capital development, that lead to higher standards of living, that lead to fewer things like infant mortality, that lead to fewer things like infectious disease and murder and all of that. And so you have this line of thinkers, and of course it precedes Smith, but you have to start somewhere. So I'm starting with Smith, right? We have John Stuart Mill in the top right, who comes about a century later, and he argues in a similar line that the role of the state, or the role of laws and social norms, are to prevent people from harming other people, right? So John Stuart Mill advocates his harm principle, that the state doesn't have license to invade on somebody's rights unless they're actually committing a harm against somebody else. Now to me, harm is a little bit ambiguous, and I think he was right, but I think it's just a little bit too imprecise. But that spirit of that argument is deeply embedded in libertarian intuition, in libertarian thinking, that, right, as long as you're not harming other people, you're allowed to do what you like, right? And that sort of creativity and openness and optionality allows for tremendous, growth in society and social trust and all of this. We have on the left one of my heroes, Ludwig von Mises, who was the sort of head of the Austrian school. And if you were attended the prior talk I gave on Austrian economics, sort of describes some of his pure economic contributions. But Mises was also a classic liberal, and he also defended, I guess he didn't use the word libertarianism, but he defended his classic liberalism on the basis that, hey, look, we all prefer health to sickness. We all prefer abundance to poverty. We all prefer happiness to misery, and so on and so forth. And so we should limit the opportunity for people to commit violence against each other, because that is the strongest way for all of that to disintegrate. And so Mises was a classic liberal, very powerful proponent of freedom in this country and in Europe, where he fled during the war. But he grounded his commitment to classic liberal ideas on a consequentialist or on a utilitarian basis. Essentially that if you adopt this pattern, society improves in these ways, and that's really what we care about. So this is his position. And I also included Friedman in here, just because I wanted to include other economists at the same time. But Friedman, Milton Friedman, his son David Friedman, grandson Patrick Friedman, I think, they're all essentially utilitarians, right? They all essentially have the same kind of argument. And this is a straightforward argument, right? If there's rules we can live by and people are happier under some set of rules versus another set of rules, on the face of it, why wouldn't we support that? So none of the additional slides and additional topics that I'll introduce will contradict this, but there are other takes on this question. So the next group I want to discuss are what I will call natural law thinkers. And so we have folks like John Locke, like Lessinger Spooner, like Ayn Rand, like Murray Rothbard, that don't disagree with the points that von Mises and Smith and Mill make, that society's better off if we're all peaceful with each other, but they ground that commitment on a different basis than just that it produces good consequences, right? So they ground their commitment to private property, classic liberalism, libertarianism, in Rothbard's case, anarcho-capitalism. They ground this in the idea that people are self-owners, and that their liberty cannot be ethically violated by another by virtue of the fact that they are rational agents, by virtue of the fact that they are human beings that can make choices, choose their own destiny, that they have this sort of right, this sort of dignity embedded within them. And so some of these different thinkers come at it from sort of different directions. So John Locke in the top left there, also sort of stands in the same domain as Adam Smith as a tremendous contributor to this classical liberal idea. He makes the argument that that there is a natural law that exists in the same way that there are laws of physics, laws of the universe. There are ethical laws, and he grounds that actually in a sort of religious standpoint, right? So Locke was not an atheist, so he grounded this idea of natural law into the sort of sense, well, it's really, you're made in the image of God, this is God's law, and we are sort of understanding it in our domain. But the principle is that people own themselves, and that is a fact, right? You make your choices. You have authority over your movements of your body, over what you say or don't say, right? You are the ultimate authority on how your body moves and what it does to the earth and what it transforms. And so Locke makes this argument that people, when they encounter nature is not owned. Nature is wilderness. Nature is just unowned. A man comes in and he makes something with it, right? He tills the field, he builds a fence, he builds a house, he irrigates the land in some way, and this action into the earth transforms it, and it creates an objective claim. It creates an objective claim in him to that property. And so Locke actually is one of the first philosophers to argue very coherently for a basis for private property on this basis, right? And so if we have the earth and wilderness and people are creating and developing on it, then they can of course trade that, they can of course sell that, they can gift it, you can use it under various contracts and so forth. And the way that Locke thinks about this is that if it's unowned and you're the first person to use it, first come, first served basis, right? Now he has a little bit of a proviso, like you should leave enough for other people and all that sort of thing, right? But essentially, the idea is that if there's land unowned or resources unowned, and you imprint your signature on it in some way, mixing your labor into it, it becomes yours. And so this is an extension of your body. This is not altogether different from your body. And so for libertarians, and from a libertarian ethical standpoint, property is not something distinct from the body, it is an extension of the body, because you have to use your labor and your time and your energy to transform something into property. And so violations of property, in the form of theft, in the form of destruction or arson, are derivative of aggressions against people's bodies. There are violations of people's bodies, right? And so that's why libertarianism is so concerned with property and property rights. Many libertarians, including Rothbard, would actually argue that the body is itself property, that you sort of homestead when you're born, and the body is the original property that we own and mix our labor with and all of that. So there's different points. I won't go into Spooner and Rand so much, but the idea that these thinkers argue about libertarianism and the idea and the justification for why I cannot apply force against you has nothing to do, in principle, with would it be good or bad if we all did this, or how would society look if I could take whenever I want or whatever. These are relevant or secondary concerns. The primary issue that they describe, and the primary issue that they are motivated by, is that property violations or aggression, initiations of force, these are all sort of interchangeable. These are violations of a man's or a person's intrinsic dignity and his intrinsic liberty by virtue of being a human, a rational agent. And so you have this original principle of self-ownership that is discussed, and from there, additional ethical positions are built on it. And so Rothbard has a very interesting argument where he tries to prove the fact that we are all self-owners, and he invites you, to ask, what is the alternative if we are not self-owners? If I do not own myself, and Pat does not own herself, and everyone here is not their own individual owner. Well, the alternative is that some people own other people. Right? There's some Übermenschen and there's some Untermenschen. Right? There's some higher class and there's some lower class. Well, this won't actually work as a principle for people qua people. Right? If you're part of this caste, you own this caste, whatever. That's not a universalizable principle. And so that just fails to be a general human ethic. Right? Because who knows where you'll be born and all this. So it's not a valid way to determine who owns whom. And the other alternative Rothbard supposes is that, okay, maybe there is no group A and group B and all of this. Maybe we all own some tiny little aliquot share of each other. Right? Maybe everyone in this room, 50 people in this room, maybe we all own 1/50th of each other. Right? That is universalizable in some sense, right? Where it doesn't matter what group you're part of or this or that, but of course you run into obviously absurd contradictory outcomes from that, where I can't do anything unless I have permission from all of you that I get to do it, because I only own 1/50th of me, and I need 49/50ths to get all your consent before I can come up here and speak. And so do all of you, right? So it's a complete standstill, because I can't even ask for consent because I only own 1/50th of my mouth to ask for it. Anyway, it just doesn't work. And so from this sort of paradoxical position, Rothbard sort of proves that the only possible ownership principle that makes sense is that we all just own each other, that we all own ourselves individually and completely. And from that basis, we can trade. From that basis, we can exchange. From that basis, we can give, and we can orient our lives with freedom that is obviously intrinsic to all living beings. So, the next position I'd like to discuss is a bit of a more esoteric position. It's not as discussed or known in libertarian circles. Primarily, libertarianism is defended on the first two principles, right? That abiding by this rule is just best for everyone. Let's all agree not to punch each other in the face. Let's all agree not to steal each other's shit, and it'll be great. Second principle is that, hey, listen, whether it be good or not, you don't have a right to in the first place, because I have something intrinsic in me that you are violating. This is a natural right position, right? So these are primarily the two positions libertarianism is defended on, and I think they're good positions. What Roger Long does here is he actually approaches this more from a sort of Greek Aristotelian virtue ethics position. And what he argues is that actually these two positions are not so different, right? They're not so conceptually isolable from each other, right? And you kind of think about this, it makes sense, right? If I want to get someone's opinion on some policy, right, about I don't know, affirmative action, or about immigration, or about minimum wage laws, or whatever, chances are people are going to have an objection to it on economic sort of consequentialist grounds and on sort of grounds of justice, right? It's rare that you would feel one way about it but not have the other position, right? So let's take an example of, let's say COVID quarantine, right? The whole lockdown, the whole situation here, right? All sorts of good objections to it, right? Many of the objections had to do with, well, you're doing this to the economy and people can't work, people are going to suffer, and people are going to die because they're not going to get the medical care they need for the cancer they have, and all the whole sort of thing, right? Other position you have is that, hey, this is just wrong in principle, because you don't own these people. They're not your cattle. They're not your property. You don't get to do what you want with people just because you think it's a good idea, right? And so these are both true. And I will submit to you that most items of any kind of policy we talk about, from war to intellectual property to arguments over abortion or not, whatever, actually people will rely on both of these bases, right? And so you have it would be uncomfortable for someone to be, let's say, a utilitarian and to be pressed into a corner that their position is really unjust, right? However many of you have had these discussions about, like, well, if you have one sick person, can doctors sacrifice one innocent person to save 10 lives, right? This kind of question, right? You know, you may feel like, well, you're saving 9 people, clearly better for society, clearly better overall, would do it, but the actual people that support utilitarian sort of arguments like this would recoil if they felt that it was actually an unjust thing to do, right? And so we have people that are utilitarians that also care deeply about issues of justice and rights and the intrinsic liberties of people, and we have natural law theorists like Rothbard and others that believe in the inviolability of this intrinsic virtue people have, but would also be very deeply upset and concerned and disturbed if it turned out that, let's say, that free trade was just disastrous for the planet, right? Or if you know, if free exchange of ideas led to mass death, that would be extremely bad. And so what Long argues is that even though we can describe utilitarian and natural law positions as different bases for justification of libertarianism, it never happens that you actually have one without the other. And so what Long tries to argue from a virtue ethics standpoint is that justice and benefit are actually defined in terms of each other. They go together. In a certain sense, what counts as a just action is informed by its effect on people, and what benefits accrue to people, the idea of benefit, is itself informed by how we believe people should be respected. And so, from his position, you know, choosing one or the other as your main preferred basis for justification is a bit narrow. And so he sort of has this both and position on the utilitarian and natural law positions. And there's more to unpack on him. He's a bit of a, I mean, he's super interesting, but a little bit of a, let's say, not an alien, how should I say it, but a bit of a different position in the typical discourse. So I wanted to include him. If anybody here is interested in Greek philosophy and Aristotle and the Stoics, then they will understand a bit more of where he's coming from. But his libertarianism is a position based off of the fact that justice and benefit are not two separate things that we need to think about or trade off on in some way. They are part of the same larger whole. They are both virtues that need to be unified to understand freedom and understand justice properly. So, let me continue. So, we have a final position that I'll discuss, which is the idea of libertarianism from Kantian direction, right? And so, if anyone here is sort of familiar with Immanuel Kant, you'll know that he was a tremendous force in the European Enlightenment, inaugurated all sorts of new ways of thinking, frameworks, concepts that we still use today in academic philosophy. And while Kant himself was not a classic liberal, he was a sort of classic constitutional republic, you could sort of say. His ideas on ethics are groundbreaking, and they help to provide even more of a foundation for what we believe in, that force and violence is wrong against others. And the way that he does this is he's not looking at so much the outcomes of behaviors or actions, right? If I commit some crime and harm some of you, well, that's going to harm society in this way, and that would not be good, right? Outcome he's not so interested in. And the sort of sense of being some special creature, made by God or not made by God, is also not so relevant to him in this case. What Kant is concerned with is the idea of rationality, and the idea that we are advanced creatures and we have rational minds, and we can violate that or we can maintain that. And in his position, he advances what's known as a categorical imperative, which is basically the basics for what you must do as a rational agent to maintain your rationality, right? So we sort of see this played out a bit in the legal system, right? Where as a free person, you are afforded certain liberties and certain benefit of the doubt, certain privileges, let's say. But if you're a convicted criminal, you are not afforded that benefit of the doubt. You're not afforded those liberties, right? And the idea sort of behind that is that, well, you did some horrible thing to some person, and that is a reflection on your character, and therefore we can treat you in certain ways that we could not treat people of higher character. And so, thinking about Kant's ethics, or his meta-ethics, he's really interested in people's maxims, or people's intentions, right? And so, what he argues is that we should have an ethical norm that can be universalized. So I mentioned this sort of before, describing the natural law position, and Kant really takes this universalizable principle as a cornerstone of his logic, right? So an ethical principle like only women can get drunk on Tuesdays is not a universalizable position. Does not apply to all humans, right? Or an ethical principle that women must wear certain clothing only certain times of the year. This is not a universalizable position, right? These may be social customs, maybe other types of social norms, but from a pure ethical standpoint, the only things that can really work are those norms, those actions guided by certain intentions that could be true if they were all active, if they were all followed, that they apply to everyone. And so this is his sort of first principle. And the second principle is he sees rationality, and he sees us as rational agents, and that there's a duty there, which is that you must respect a certain dignity of other rational beings, right? So if I treat you in certain ways, in certain injurious ways, or in certain ways that demean your dignity, say by committing force, by taking your things, right? Kant's formulation is more like treating people as means, not as ends, right? If I treat you as a means, if I treat you as some object that I can dispose of at will, again, you don't have a will because you're just an object to me, I am actually not respecting the dignity of your being. And that violation undermines my own position. And so we have this attitude where we see human beings and people as not having rights per se. He wouldn't describe it that way. Discussing of rights is more of a natural law theorist, but of people of having a certain type of dignity that you must respect. And if you don't, it's a reflection on you. And so what we want is to obey the station that we are at, and to act with the grace and to act with the propriety that our kind of creature demands. Right? So there's various creatures, and not all of them are like us. Very few. And so they act in different ways towards each other, right? We have lions and hunting animals, and we have predators, and we have all sorts of things in the animal kingdom that we don't follow. And so Kant describes this as a sort of difference in dignity, right? It's only when we get to human beings and human civil society that we actually recognize the merits of peace and trade and exchange and consent and all of these virtues. And you must respect those in order to retain your humanity in some sense. Right? So this position leads to a libertarian ethical position, in my view. Kant is not a libertarian. He's some kind of classic conservative. He's not a classic liberal. But his position reinforces what we were just describing earlier, right? The idea that we all have that we all are the types of creatures that have this sort of dignity, that have this sort of element of superiority versus other forms, requires us to treat each other in certain ways. And so one of those ways is to not use people as objects, not to treat them as means, but to treat them as ends, right? So we could see it, in a and there's ways to do this, even in peaceful ways that would be injurious to someone's dignity, right? So I'm friends with Josh, right? And the belief, implicit, I think, is that we are friends because we enjoy each other's company, because we respect each other's virtues and interests and abilities and all sorts of things, right? But if you were to come to believe that I was your friend only so that I could get on stage here and come and talk to these wonderful people here, you would feel immediately that's an injury, that is some disrespect, right? That I'm actually deceitful, right? That I am treating you as not actually a person or a human, but as just some complicated bit of the environment I have to navigate and get bent to my own way, my own will, right? So we think about psychopaths, think about various people that use more manipulative sort of approaches dealing with people, right? As soon as it's discovered that there's deceit and manipulation, there is an affront. And I think we all sort of feel that emotionally. And this, I think, this is what Kant is trying to articulate philosophically, which is that intuitively we all demand to be treated with a certain amount of dignity and respect and civility. And if it's discovered that somebody is not, right, you don't have to punch them in the face, right? But if they lie to me, right, so this is another point that Kant makes, is that if people even tell you the wrong thing, they lie to you, what are they doing? Well, they're not respecting your right to the truth. They're not respecting the fact that you can have information delivered to you and make up your own mind and choose your own action, right? I'm going to tell you something different so that you go this way or go that way because it benefits me. And so this is an affront. And so this idea of respecting people's dignity extends not to just to lying, which is sort of Kant's, sort of the main thing that we'll pick out about him, and not to deceit and other forms of being of undermining people, but to me, also physical violations of your body, right? What is rape except somebody using somebody else as an object, as a means to some end that they want to gratify, right? What is theft if not you're just a human walking bank that I can just go take my money out, and use it the way that I want to? And so when you get into Kant's positions on rationality and dignity, it leads inevitably to libertarian conclusions. It leads inevitably to the idea that people are self-sovereign, that they have the, let's say the right, I'm going to mix words a little bit here, but that they have the right to choose their own destiny, to author their own actions, and that your behavior toward them must respect that, right? Now, if again, to sort of Kant's point, the purpose, the crucial part is really the intention, is what he focuses on, not the outcome so much, right? So if I am talking with Brandon, in the back, and I want to, get something from him, he's got something valuable in his left back pocket that really belongs to me, and I want it, and I'm gonna try to wangle and finagle whatever, but he knows I'm a slippery, sly kind of guy. He's not going to do it, right? He can sense it. Even if I fail in my pickpocketing or in my theft, it's still an affront, right? Now, to Rothbard and the other natural law theorists, it's not an affront from a pure libertarian position, right? If I try to harm somebody but I fail, or if I am unable to complete whatever violation I'm trying to because I'm stopped, or I in some sense can't complete it, no violation has happened, right? And even from the utilitarian standpoint, no bad outcome has happened, right? Brandon still has the one ring in his pocket, or whatever he's got, right? But for Kant, it's actually the intention that matters, because the intent to deceive, the intent to rob or steal, is an affront to my character now, and this reduces me in the eyes and the status of the rest of the community, and now I am a target, and a justifiable target, for other people to act in those ways toward me. So this idea of justification is a segue into another step that I'd like to go, which is that the man on the right is Hans Hoppe, modern living libertarian theorist, and he is a Kantian. He was a student of Rothbard and other folks, and Mises and other classic liberals, but the way that he wants to defend the non-aggression principle is on Kantian grounds, essentially. And so I see him as a successor to this Kantian tradition, and what he argues is that, let me explain what problem he's trying to solve. So, looking at Kant and looking at the natural law theorists like Rothbard and Rand, right? They argue they make some form of the argument that human beings are special, have intrinsic dignity, that they're self-owners, and therefore you shouldn't do X, Y, or Z to them, right? And so this is a normative position that is being made on top of a descriptive fact. right? If I say that, you are a special person, therefore I should not harm you, those are actually two different types of claims being made, right? One is a fact about reality, that you are self-owner, right? That Rodney, only Rodney, chooses what to smoke and when to smoke and how often he smokes, right? Nobody else can make that decision but you, right? That is a fact, right? I mean, I could not move your arm and say, well, I don't have telepathy, it's just not possible, right? But that descriptive fact of reality is, there's a chasm, let's say, between that and what I should or should not do, right? And so in philosophical circles, this is known as the fact-value dichotomy. It's known as the is-ought gap, if you've heard that. And the problem is that there ain't no way to get from an is to an ought, right? So we can describe the world in all sorts of descriptive ways we want, material, chemical, scientific, factual, whatever, but from that basis, there really is no good way to jump this chasm into now I can make moral claims or ethical claims about the elements of that environment that I just described. Now, that's not a problem for most people, because most people are not anal philosophers, but it is a problem for academic philosophers because it means that there's no good way to bridge. And so all of the discussions about what you should or you shouldn't, you ought not to, right? And that's sort of couched even in the terms like violation, right? Terms like injury, terms like violence. These all have, they all connote a normative position, right? Should or should not, ought or ought not. These are normative claims, right? But there's no good way to get from A to B. And Kant tries, Locke tries, the other natural law theorists try. Some of them invoke God, some of them invoke other types of transcendent arguments, and in my opinion, they don't really work. And I wanted to discuss Hans Hoppe because the interesting thing about his position is that he actually doesn't even try to make the jump. He stays completely in the factual realm. He stays completely in the realm of the realm of the fact of the descriptive nature of reality. But he's able to defend libertarian ethical position without ever having to wander into normative claims, ought or ought not, good or bad, right or wrong, should or shouldn't. And the way he does it is that he, again, is sort of taking some of Kant's ideas about universalization, about rationality and so forth, and he sort of makes the argument that you can't even argue for non-libertarian positions. Right? So we all have friends that believe the government ought to do some such thing or the other or the third or whatever, right? Now, I don't know if you agree with me, but I believe that the government is intrinsically based on violations of property and violations of people's rights, right? And that's not to say that governance is illegitimate or that social order is illegitimate, but the nature of the state as a sort of monopolist sort of relies on the fact that people don't want to pay money, but they have guns, and so we're going to pay the money. Okay. So there's all sorts of policies that emerge from that, right? People have opinions about all of these topics, about immigration, or about war, or about trade, or about banking, or about any of this. And all of these things, you've got friends that probably argue for universal health care, or that they argue that we should keep out Mexicans, or they should argue about any kind of government policy, right? But the problem is that making that kind of argument ends up contradicting itself. And this is the point Hoppe is trying to make, is that any proposal for a non-libertarian position or ethical policy is self-defeating. Logically self-defeating. Not practically. It may be that way too, right? So like, if you're familiar with the economics of minimum wage laws, right? The idea is that, well, the unskilled and the poor, they don't make enough money, they can barely live, we should raise the minimum wage because they make more money, it'd be better that way. Well, this is economically self-defeating. Right? This is practically self-defeating because what happens if you mandate that employers must pay a certain wage above market clearing for the labor? Well, they just won't. And so now you have all this unemployment. You're going to have all this surplus of labor, and oh gee, now they're earning $0 per hour instead of whatever you thought was unacceptable before. Right? So there's all sorts of these policies that are sort of practically self-defeating. But the point Hoppe wants to make is that even making the proposal for these things is conceptually self-defeating. And the way he argues this is that he makes various points. He says, look, I'm going to have a discussion with somebody, and let's say that they want to propose some anti-libertarian thing, right? They want to propose that the rich or taxed disproportionately, some extreme thing because we got to pay for schools for all the kids and whatever, right? And you're going to have discussion with them. Well, what needs to be true in order for us even to have a discussion? A number of things actually have to be true in order for us to have a discussion, right? One of the things that has to be true in order for us to have a discussion is that I have to believe that I own myself. Automatically. If I did not believe that I owned myself, then I could not justify opening my mouth to say such and such, because the mouth is part of my body, right? Just like the point about Rothbard's argument earlier about the 1/50th share, right? If you're not a full self-owner, then you would have you can't actually use your body. You can't choose how your body's used. But the fact that we're having a discussion, the fact that we're engaging in this kind of action, means that automatically I must believe I am a self-owner. The second point that Hoppe makes is that I must believe the other person is also a self-owner. Because if I did not believe that, I wouldn't bother engaging in debate. I wouldn't bother engaging in argument or discussion. I would just use them, right? I would just exploit them. I would just use them as an object, use them as a means to my end. But if I'm having a conversation with you, having a conversation with Rodney, right? No matter how how stoned out of his gourd he is, right? If I'm negotiating with him for something, then I am offering a proposal. He is going to entertain it. He is going to just tell me something else or counter proposal or whatever it is. I'm going to entertain it. We're going to have a discussion, right? It doesn't have to be about goods. It can be about ideas, right? So we can have a conversation about totalitarianism, Nazi Germany, any of these things. I have my opinions, and I'm going to tell my opinions about this. You're going to digest and think about this. You're going to tell me what you think. I'm going to digest, think. We're going to go back. But that pattern implies that each of us must believe that each of us are self-owners. That we're independent, autonomous people that are capable of forming and digesting the information as a fair player in this exchange. And so this idea from Hoppe is that argumentation or discussion or this kind of voluntary interaction requires non-aggression, conceptually. And so any deviation from that cannot be supported in an argument, right? It's like if I argued, I cannot argue. It's self-defeating immediately, right? I can't argue that I can't argue. I can only argue that I can't argue. So it just sort of eats itself. So in the same way, if I'm going to argue that you should be robbed to pay for my kids' schools, because God knows I'm not going to teach them, so I need to have some state functionaries do the job for me, right? Well, if we're having this discussion, there's a contradiction here, because the content of what I am describing is contradicting the form in which it is being presented. Because the content of the argument is that you don't own yourself or your property, you're just a part of nature, and you're wild, and you can defend yourself, and you're all sorts of not crazy, but you're still just part of nature, and I'm going to take from you to get to for me or for others or whatever, right? But if we're having a discussion about it, then it already implies that you're not part of nature, or that you're rational, that you're a rational agent, right? And so this is sort of Hoppe's main point. This is what's known as argumentation ethics. The idea is that any anti-libertarian position that is argued immediately is contradicted conceptually by the fact that in arguments we have to respect each other's rights in that exchange. And so there's other elements of Hoppe's thoughts that lead into sort of libertarian world, the libertarian social order, and all these things. But the seed, the root of his position is that any alternative is just logically contradictory. And so we can argue about all sorts of other things, whether this candy tastes better than that candy, or whether you want to go out for drinks on Sunday, no, you've got this thing Sunday, okay, we'll do it on Monday instead. All sorts of discussion, all sorts of argumentation, debate, blah, 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 all possible. But as soon as some element of the debate becomes about violating somebody's rights, and they are trying to prove or promote or persuade that such and such person's rights ought to be violated. Now, they're not going to say that, but that is what's happening, right? But as soon as that kind of argument is being made, they are standing on immediately impossible, shaky ground. And so this is actually an interesting argument, an interesting position, because it's kind of a it's a position. What's the name for it? It's basically a position that doesn't prove itself, but just invalidates other wrong positions, right? So Hoppe doesn't really end up, trying to promote the idea of, like Locke did, about mixing your labor and land, and God gave me this brain, and so therefore I have rights. He doesn't try to justify it from some kind of first principles basis. What he's trying to show is that from a position of logic and rationality, anything contrary to libertarianism just doesn't make sense. And so he sort of proves it in the negative sense, right? Any kind of socialist policy, redistributive policy, militaristic aggressive policy, any kind of little, even whatever basic small things. We all go out for pizza, and we don't really discuss how it's going to be split because we're going to get beer and pizza. But at the end of it, we all turn, and we find Kyle and say, Kyle, you're paying for all of it.
He's great.
We've all decided, right? We've all decided you're covering pizza tonight, right? This is, micro democracy in action. That is smuggling in this claim or this position that Kyle is just a resource to be exploited. And it would be best if the other 8 of us got to have free pizza. I don't want to pay. Why would I? There's money sitting right there. Why would we pay? Right? So even at a very small level, there's arguments or debates people have that invoke theft or invoke notions of appropriation or exploitation. It doesn't have to be at some galactic government level of war in Iraq or any of that stuff. But even on a small scale, discussions about who owns what and what can we do with it, if they promote anti-libertarian positions or outcomes, from Hoppe's standpoint, they just immediately fail, because you just can't argue for those things, because argumentation itself requires that you believe in them already. So, anti-libertarian positions from Kant and then from Hoppe on top of it are self-defeating. And so that's an interesting turn to take, rather than trying to justify from first principles why we have rights and why we have liberties and why freedom is great and for peace and prosperity. This is all trying to defend our first principles. What these two are doing, in my opinion, is just trying to show the opposite, right? They're just trying to show that the negative is impossible. And so by default, the libertarian position is the only justifiable or defensible one. And that leads me into the last major thinker that I'll discuss, which is Michael Huemer. And he's not a Kantian. Huemer is sort of an intuitionist. He's got a bit of a different moral background. But what he argues in his book is that let's just forget all of this highfalutin academic philosophy. Let's not use Latin when English will do. Let's just take it to a certain common sense standpoint, right? The default position for most people, for most of us, is to treat people as adults, to cooperate with each other, to ask for permission, to ask for consent, to try to trade, to be fair in our dealings with each other. Now, are there exceptions where we should not be fair, or this doesn't deserve it, whatever? Yeah, possibly. He's not committed ideologically on some kind of philosophical ground. But on the face of it, prima facie, we're all adults here. Why can't we work these things out, right? And the problem is that people don't want to respect that sort of kindergarten ethic, right? So I sort of sometimes think about libertarianism as a kind of kindergarten ethics, right? Don't hurt people, don't take their stuff. Very basic. Right? You learn it when you're 6 years old. Maybe if you're advanced, you learn when you're 4 years old, right? And Huemer's book is basically going through all sorts of different arguments people have made for government and for redistribution, made for redistributive policies, and showing that no, they actually fail. This actually doesn't work, right? So he goes through social contract theory. He goes through sort of democracy, theories of democracy. He goes through all sorts of different arguments that people have made to justify the state, And his conclusion is none of them are actually valid, right? So it's another kind of negative argument position. And I find it actually very refreshing because Hoppe and Kant are actually very hard to read. Humer is not hard to read. He's a very good writer. And he basically asks like the obvious question, right? Which is like, we're all on this planet, we're all human beings, we're all essentially, equal, let's say in authority and status and so forth. None of us have been touched by God and we're 11 feet tall and we're some pharaoh or anything. We're all just normal humans, right? And the common way we treat each other is to treat each other in that way, right? And so, if you live in a neighborhood and someone comes to your door, this is like the first example he gives in this book to motivate it. Someone comes to your door, knocks on your door, and say, hey, we're raising money to, build this thing over here because the thing over here, the road sucks, or the housing thing, whatever, you need to give some money for this, right? And you say, well, gee, I don't use that, I'm not really that interested in it, sorry, thanks, but no thanks. And you see that he's got a revolver on his head, right? So no, you don't understand. We're raising money to build this thing here, so we need some of your money to do this, right? We would all see that as an obvious theft, right? An obvious robbery, right? Who the hell can come up to your door and hold you at gunpoint to take your money for some good cause, let alone some bad cause, right? But even for some good cause, we would still bristle at that and feel that that was an injustice, right? And so Humer's question is, why do certain people that are government agents get licensed to do that, but not the rest of us? Right? Why is it that somebody that has a badge and a costume and went through the whole training, whatever, why is it through some arcane, complex labyrinth of legal institutions and laws, why is it that human could come to my house and basically take the money from me, or by proxy through tax collectors or through whatever? How is that justified? Right? They're all just humans, right? And so he says, well, maybe we all picked that person to do that. You say, okay, well, maybe that may be true, right? We all sort of picked this guy to walk the beat and to go, make sure that no one's walking into unlocked home or whatever it is. But the problem is we get back to the pizza example, right? It's like, well, maybe we all picked for Kyle to pay for the pizza, and therefore he has, in this case, it's a negative position, right? In this case, it's negative, unless you love giving pizza for free. But, to say that we all picked this guy to commit this act that we would all sort of register as unethical, does that license him? The fact that a bunch of people want him to do this sort of thing? Not really. And he sort of breaks down sort of why that is not true, because there's all sorts of examples we can give for, democratic institutions promoting very unjust policies, and very, all sorts of criminal actions. He says, okay, well, maybe the argument is that you live in society, and the unwritten rule of society is that people get to do this to you. Okay, well, can I do this to other people? No, you can't. Only God can do this to certain people. Well, why is that? Right. So we start getting into sort of social contract theory, justification for government, right? And in various forms, in various ways, that fails, right? And it fails in an obvious way. If anyone's read Lysander Schooner, if anyone's read the, No Treason, his book on the Constitution, right? The Constitution is supposed to be a contract, right? It's supposed to be a contract between the people and some new federal government that's been created, right? We have terms called the Bill of Rights. They cannot do this, and we whatever. Well, anybody here sign that contract? Did anybody in the room when it was made? Did anybody have their signature on it? No, I don't think so. It was 250 years ago. Probably not. So, Spooner's point in his book is that, hey, listen, the only people that would have been bound by the Constitution are the people that signed it in the first place. Right? I can't sign up my children for slavery. I can't bind posterity by signing a thing now. Right? So it doesn't apply. Right? But at least in the case of the Constitution, it was an actual contract, which is rare. It is not true in most other countries, at least at that time. There was no such thing. It was just king ordained by God, or parliament made up of a bunch of people that all want to pick the person who's going to tell us what to do. Right? That's why this is a social contract. Right? If it were a real contract, you could exit. If it was a real contract, you could go to say, hey, you didn't fulfill. I want my money back. I'm ending my subscription to your protection agency. Well, there is no such thing. There is no such real contract with government. That's why it's a social contract. That's why it's a hypothetical contract. So all these various forms that have been made to justify the idea that we live in some kind of contractual relationship with the government. Well, this is just not true, and it doesn't work in various ways. And so humor sort of dispels this. And there's various other theories, right, that the state is ordained by God, just like the church on earth. And in the Bible, it says that all earthly authorities are to be respected, blah blah blah, blah, and all sorts of stuff, right? It's like theological arguments to defend government, and there's economic arguments to defend government that people make. They say, well, hey, listen, if we didn't have government, if we didn't have this system of people that were able to violate rights that the rest of us can't do, only these people, well, then we wouldn't have roads. And as libertarians, we all know the incredible intrinsic value of roads. And we wouldn't be able to solve what are known as collective action problems. Right? These are problems that require a lot of people to get together and coordinate for the solution to be effective. Right? So let's say that pollution, and climate change and earth warming, let's say this is a collective action problem, right? If I adopt a carbon neutral, carbon negative position, I'm not going to solve the problem. Right? If all of us do it, maybe we won't solve the problem. We sort of need all of humanity to do it. Right? This is like the obvious example of a collective action problem. But there's others, right? So various economists put forward ideas that the state produces public goods that we actually can't do ourselves. We can create private goods, right? We can create like Nike sneakers, and we can create, like rockets to take satellites in space. But like what we cannot do is figure out how to mediate disputes in a peaceful way. It's just too complicated for individual people to do, and so we need some kind of mega institution to provide courts, and to provide law, and to provide the lawyers, of course, and to provide, all of the appurtenances of that whole system, right? So the legal system, protection, security, these things are all described as public goods. Some people believe that education, is a public good, right? We need all the children to be educated in our ideology. Otherwise, the earth won't, we're all going to be stuck in the Bronze Age, right? You may be smart, you may have, gone to college, got a university education, but if everyone didn't, then society as a whole isn't going to get any smarter. So we really need to make sure this thing is solved as a collective all at once. And so this kind of argument, this kind of public goods argument that's made by certain economists and other thinkers, it doesn't hold any water, right? So we actually can solve all of these problems without the state forcing a top-down solution for all of us on it. We can negotiate, we can coordinate, we can trade, we can contract with each other for these various things. And it's interesting to see what sort of libertarian alternatives emerge when the state, let's say, exits that domain. So it's an interesting example. I'm going a little bit off topic here, but that's also what I do. There's an interesting example of a company in Detroit called the Threat Management Center. They are a private security firm. Now, I don't know if you know much about Detroit, but it's not doing as well as it used to these days. And there's whole regions of the city that police just refuse to go and just refuse to enforce. They don't have the numbers, they don't have the people, there's too much crime, there's all sorts. They just abandoned parts of Detroit. But people live there. People have homes there, they have businesses there, they have all sorts of things there. And so they need security, they need protection, they need a way to live peacefully among their neighbors, even though the area, the neighborhood, might be a little rough. And so there is opportunity for private entrepreneurs and private groups to emerge to provide for that. And one such group called the Threat Management Center, which is great. And what they do actually is much more like de-escalation and much more sort of social engagement and much more proactive work like patrolling and sort of establishing themselves in the community as protectors, right? Rather than what is ordinarily done by law enforcement, which is nothing.
If you're lucky.
And then there's a crime, and then you're murdered, and they're going to go and poke in your head and say, yeah, he's dead. We're going to go find him, right? And so this whole different paradigm of protection from law enforcement to actual establishing peace, establishing grounds for people to cooperate with each other, this is an entrepreneurial avenue for this organization. And they have interesting YouTube videos. You can find more about them if you want. And what's the guy's name? Dale Brown. Is it Dale Brown? He's spoken, right, at
Not here.
not here. I think he spoke at Liberty Forum or some other libertarian event sometimes. I don't know that he is a libertarian, but the point is that all of these things that people argue that the state must do, or we're all going to fall into a spike pit of anarchy and chaos and lawlessness and all this, only appears that way because the state sort of currently does it, and it's just hard to imagine the alternatives, right? So like imagine that you were somebody brought in. This is the point that like Bob Murphy makes, right? They're like, imagine you're brought into North Korea, and they want to start liberalizing some of their economy, right? This whole food nationalization thing is just a bad idea. It's just killing everyone. So they're going to start opening up a little bit, but they don't know quite how to do it. They're kind of scared. We got this communist thing going on for a long time. Seems to be kind of working. I don't know. Let's say you were brought in to privatize or to liberalize the food agricultural area, and they started asking you, well, okay, that's all good, but like how many grocery stores would there be, and exactly how many avocados would they stock, and exactly where would all these things be, and how would it work? We need to know, right? This is sort of the planning mentality. Please tell us exactly how it would work. Well, it's impossible. You wouldn't know. It'd be impossible to know going in there. But it would still be true that you should open it up. You should allow trade in food. You should allow people to own land. You should allow for markets. And so sometimes libertarians have a hard time with this sort of public goods discussion, and it's true for me too, because we don't have the sort of ready counterfactuals at hand to prove, like, oh, hey, we solved this, we can do this, right? When the state has owned mass education for 100 years under some Prussian military model, it's kind of hard sometimes to say, no, you don't need to treat kids this way, you just let them play. I say, that's fucking bullshit, you can't let them play. You gotta tell them what to learn. So, but this perspective, this position that only the state can do certain things, and without it we would all be, up shit's creek. This is sort of a public goods style argument. And so Humer really goes through all of these various justifications for the state and for institutionalized aggression, and they're all just unsatisfactory. So it's another argument from negation, essentially, that there is no good way to justify treating certain people as less than adults, or treating them inferior, taking from them, exploiting them in this sort of way that we live in today. And then the rest of Humer's book is sort of describing what would an anarchist society look like, what would a peaceful society look like, all of that. And this probably concludes the 3 or 4 different dimensions that libertarians have tried to defend this principle of non-aggression on different grounds, right? So there's the grounds that it just works better if we're all peaceful and don't try to knife each other in the back. Like, that would make for a better world, right? There is the point that you don't have the right to do it anyway, right? I'm self-sovereign, and you can't hold me at knife point to demand money for pizza because you're actually violating some intrinsic quality I have as a human being, right? You have the third position, which is the sort of Kantian, Hoppian position, which is that, even entertaining this idea or even intending to treat people in this way is already an unethical position. You're already undermining your own status as a rational person by intending to harm or by advocating for this kind of harm. And then we have Humer as this sort of argument from negation, which is that any of these arguments all fail anyway. And so the default position is to respect each other, to respect each other's property and our rights, and build a society from there. So I have a bit more, but I think that's a good place to end the presentation, and I'll open it up now to the floor for questions. Yes, sir.
Awesome. Mind blown.
Thank you.
Make you so good at that.
I run as mushrooms, so you know what.
Hell yeah, man. Don't be the only one.
Thank you. I guess I just don't get it. Like the last line there says all arguments to justify the state or various aggressive policies. I think most states, including American history, it was for defensive reasons. And now maybe you can make an argument that we became aggressive and imperialistic later on, and we did.
Sure.
but the origination of the state is for defense.
That is a form of public goods argument, right? That defense is just too complicated or difficult for free people individually to solve it. So we have a king, we have a ruler to sort of organize it all at once, and that is historically how it played out, right? So the history of England, for instance, is essentially a history of the Vikings and Nordic peoples sort of conquering and taking the country from the original, Celtic and Gaelic people, and Harold Hardrada, some of the sort of line of heralds and a lot of the Nordic kings were pure defensive, military men, right? But as you suggested, inevitably that sort of creeps and it creeps and it creeps and it creeps into becoming what is a full-fledged state, nation state today. And I think just sort of conceptually, the idea that a state is needed to provide for common defense is not conceptually necessary, because defense is something that can be bought and brokered individually. It's something that can be pooled collectively through insurance firms, through other types of associations. It can be provided entrepreneurially in different ways. And I think that the fact that historically certain land masses have been defended and conquered by various states is kind of a contingent matter, not a necessary matter.
Yeah, but if everybody in this room contributed $100, we can't afford tanks and planes,
Well, that's true.
Yeah.
But if 10 people break into your home, you don't stand much of a chance either. That doesn't mean that you don't have a right to defend yourself and own firearms and all of that. So in the same way, right, there's ways to pool resources. There's ways to support and strengthen each other at scale that do not require us to surrender a whole litany of rights to some local warlord monopolist. Right, and so the state provides other things than just being a warlord. It provides all sorts of services and all sorts of other elements, but the sort of seed you were talking about is like, well, we have a local strongman and his friends and his band, and they're the ones that protect us, and they're going to ask for this and from us, and we have this arrangement with them. That's not necessary, in my opinion, and I think it has played out that way historically because the idea of individual people being free and negotiating and having commerce for this is still relatively new in human history. And so all these ideas I've discussed really only go back a couple hundred years. Now you have echoes of it again in world religions, you have echoes of libertarianism in Christianity, you have it sort of all over the place, but I think the fact that states have arrogated themselves the right of common defense that's sort of a historical happenstance rather than a strictly necessary situation. And we can get into more sort of details about how the counterfactuals would work and all of that later, but I just want to give time for other people who have questions.
We're going to do just 2 or 3 more questions and then we'll call it.
Sure.
All right. So you talked about Kant earlier and his ideas of ethics and the Kantian imperative. So I read a little bit of Kant, and some things do bother me about him, like his Neoplatonism, how he pretty much believes in a world of forms. You can't trust your objective senses.
Sure.
And in that, how does he know for a fact that humans can be rational? How does he know that humans have dignity at the beginning of this phenomenological point?
Well, it's based in I would say his religious or transcendent thinking, right? So he does sort of have this view of a transcendent realm, right? So Plato has this idea of the forms, the intelligible realm, all of this. Kant has a similar notion of a transcendent realm that we cannot apprehend with our senses. I wouldn't say he doesn't trust our senses, we shouldn't trust them. Kant is in a line of empiricists he's responding to in agreement with a lot of empiricists about other questions, but how does Kant base his position of human rationality on it? Well, I guess it's a bit self-evident to him, right? In the sense that if you try to negate it, you end up in a self-defeating position, right? So if you, I guess I probably don't have the information to sort of explain it right now. It is a good question.
Yeah.
It is a good question. I would say, shooting from the hip, it stems from his belief in God, and that God, as a transcendent entity, has a hand in the making of humanity, and that rationality in humanity is an echo of God's perfection. So there's a sort of a divine element at play there in Kant. It's not that explicit, but that's where I would go.
Okay, so, hold on. One of the things that I have a trouble with being a libertarian is I feel like we're already on war footing. How does the non-aggression principle and all of these other aspects of libertarianism address the war footing or aggression against it? It's to look at a utopian result when we're not in a utopia seems to be counterproductive.
Can you describe the war footing? Can you describe
Yeah, sure. I mean, when you have, okay, if you are a peaceful, united place, and some non-peaceful, united something
I see.
comes and aggresses on you,
I see.
well, we're non-aggression, but
Sure.
how do we address the aggression?
Well, non-aggression does not prohibit defensive force.
The right to self-defense.
Right, so if you assail me, if you attack me, then I have the right to apply force upon you to mitigate or to stop completely that assault. So non-aggression is not pacifism.
Unfortunately, it doesn't work with the state, because they're not libertarian.
So a deeper question though, getting back to the other gentleman's question earlier about, well, how would two nations handle if one is libertarian and sort of, anarchic and federated and distributed, the other one is a single nation state, Napoleon's gonna march 800,000 troops across Europe. What are all the little tiny micro kingdoms of Germany going to do about it? Well, there is an opportunity there again for connection, for pooling resources, right? So the economic power of insurance companies, for instance, dwarfs that of almost all nations, right? And so these insurance companies are connected to other reinsurance firms and all sorts of networks where they connect and protect each other economically. And so it's not far-fetched to me. For instance, just as a sort of example, that, you're a customer of Prudential, you have a policy, you got some car, auto policy, home policy, whatever. Well, you might have a policy against being attacked, right? And what that means is if you are attacked, then they have resources to go and apprehend the criminal or to restore you in some way, but you would pay a premium. You'd subscribe to these things, and it could be a market of such insurance agencies that compete on quality, that compete on the services they offer, that compete on price. And the goal would be, the way that markets work, is to drive down the cost of all of these goods and to establish higher quality for these goods, right? The shoes we wear are light years better than what was worn 200 years ago. Every consumer's good that we imagine, except for maybe food, is a little better than it was 100 years ago. And that's because there's competition in markets and people are trying to solve other humans' needs, and it improves that way. So I don't think that protection or legal adjudication, dispute resolution, the court system, like all of that whole kind of legal domain, I think that is a similar good that can be negotiated and exchanged and contracted on a market. And if so, then it should obey the same principles of getting better and cheaper over time.
So we're gonna do two last questions. We'll try and keep it short.
Sure.
So Alan, did you have a question still?
I did, yeah.
Go.
First off, thank you, this was wonderful.
Thank you.
And this may be a way out there, but how would some of these libertarians sort of handle the issue of the homelessness or homeless population who doesn't really abide by the non-aggression principle?
Yeah.
Just any thoughts?
Yeah. So I guess the first example that comes to mind is becomes sort of a meme now at this point from Hans Hoppe, one of the earlier thinkers we're discussing. And the idea is that, look, if we're in a fully privatized society, fully libertarian society, there is no public space anymore, right? The homes, the land, the roads, it's all real estate owned by some organization or some other type of thing, right? And if there are vagrants on that and they are not using it in accordance with whatever the terms of it, like a park or whatever it is, well then they could be physically removed because they're trespassing, essentially. Right? If you invite me into your home for dinner and not dessert, but I stay for dessert, well, I'm trespassing. Right? And you have the right to apply some minimal necessary amount of force until we have reached a point where I'm not committing trespass on you anymore. So this sort of position, this sort of thing requires that like literally all the available land is already privatized, and so it's therefore just kind of a trivial matter of trespass. In the world we live in, that is not true, right? And there's even cases of sort of dispute. So Roderick Long, the virtue ethicist I discussed earlier, makes a very good argument in different places for the idea of commons or public property that is not state property, but is a kind of public property, right? In the sense of like, if you're villagers, if you're a member of some village and you walk through a forest to get to the area where there's fishing, and everyone's walking and beating that path down over 10 years, and there's a path emerges, a road emerges, the village owns it, right? You don't own it, and you don't own it, and we all collectively own it, because we all trod upon the leaves and twigs, and we all own the road now, right? So he sort of makes this argument that it's like, even in a fully libertarian society, there could still be libertarian commons, public property, and maybe there would be places in that way that would allow for people to live there, that as a sort of easement, right? As a sort of benefit or as a sort of privilege. So they don't all have to be exiled into the wilderness. Maybe there could be some realm in a fully libertarian society for commons for people to have a little easement and squat and sort of live on. So those are two examples. How do we solve that in our present day world with government and with welfare and the whole thing? God knows, I don't have a clue. I think about it all the time, but I don't have a clue.
Last question, JD. Do you have one? Okay, in the back.
Mine is regards to personal property.
Uh-huh.
Where you're well versed in libertarian philosophy, I wanted to know what your take was on mineral rights being severed from surface owner property.
Ooh, yeah. So there's an interesting discussion about what do you own when you interact with certain parts of the environment, right? So let's say that you're a farmer on the top of the land, and you're irrigating and you're tilling the field and all you grow crops and all that. Seems straightforward, you own that, right? But do you own the oil that's 500 feet below you? Well, why would you, right? Do you own the atmosphere extending out from your farm all the way to the edge of the universe, right? You have a little cone of the earth going all the way to the center and all the way back out to space. That doesn't seem plausible to me, because you didn't know it existed, maybe, potentially. You never interacted with it. You don't have a claim to it, right? So a lot of what property relies on is the idea of someone possessing a claim to something. So I have a claim to my body as a very primary thing, for various reasons. I have a claim to this beer because I picked it up out of a cooler that was free and somebody offered it, whatever. But actually somebody bought this beer as a pack and provided it, probably Josh. I don't know who bought this beer. Thank you whoever did, it's delicious. But if the person insisted that it was their beer, then they would have a stronger claim than I do. Right? They'd say, well, you know what, I opened it and started drinking it, but I didn't make it or buy it, whatever, okay, it's really yours. So we can think about property not just in some kind of like true or false way, like Locke had thought about it, right? You own it or you don't. You've mixed your labor and it's yours by God or it's not. We can think about property as a spectrum of claims that are either better or worse.
And who decides that?
The community ultimately would determine what claims they want to honor that they believe are correct.
But mineral can obstruct on surface. But I guess it would just be based on the contract that you're accepting the property under those conditions?
So you're talking about like what? Like if there's not like oil underground, that would be a valuable thing, but like a negative thing.
A wellhead. So a wellhead's gonna have to be maintained. A wellhead may have trucks that come and pump oil out. Like it's on the surface of the property.
Sure. So then, in that case, when you buy that property, are you buying the entirety of the oil reserve? If so, then it seems to me straightforward that you can do what you like with it,
Yeah.
as long as you're not using it to harm other people, polluting it in other people's airspace, et cetera. If the oil well, or if the natural resource is sort of commons, like a lake, fishing lake, or something kind of like that, then you would probably own it under the condition that you maintain it to some community standard, yada yada yada. So you'd have to sort of hash it out what the quality of that is. but in terms of owning things above and below what you've interacted with, there's an interesting literature in that about the oceans, really, because like different fish live at different levels of the ocean, right? And so you can fish at certain levels and be obstructed at other levels. You don't have that. Now, how do you propertize flowing water? You know, interesting question. The same types of things with like spectrum rights and like radio frequency types of stuff. How do you come to own some of these bands and these things? So there's some controversial positions. So I actually had like a final slide on like some controversial positions that not all libertarians agree on ethically, right? Abortion, you know, for instance, or immigration, or sort of public and common property ideas. So there's a lot of dispute. Just because people are libertarians, they agree with the non-aggression principle, doesn't mean that they agree with what rights do children and animals have, right? Or what rights do you have to does a fetus have, you know, for instance. So I think that question about what are your duties in response to some public resource on land that you purchase or cultivate would hinge on what does the community expect of the steward of that land. And that is always going to be a bit subjective.
That's our talk. Give it up for Mattheus.
Thank you.